Have you ever tried to make changes in your organization, your family, your community, or yourself? On today's show, we'll be talking about one of the most powerful ways you can create change. I'll be talking with TJ Elliott and Loren and Niemi, two truly remarkable human beings. Stay tuned. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Madelyn Blair, and this is Unlocked, a show all about unlocking the resilient leader in you. In a recent show, my co-host turned the tables on me and asked me a question. He asked me, why stories? Here's a short clip from that show with my answer.
Why stories, Madelyn?
Well, there are many reasons. But when we tell a story, and we tell it as a story, the listener has the opportunity to say, well, this is a story, so let me just at least listen to the story. I can judge it later on, but for now, I will listen to it. And it's not that we lose judgment, it's that we suspend it while we listen to the story.
Right.
And because we've suspended it, we're able to bring on more insights and more data. And it's a richer experience. It's a different kind of thinking. I'll give you an example. If you go to a lecture and the person opens with a story, they've got you. They've got you hooked because you've opened your mind to what they have to say. If they begin with enumerating the theories that he's going to talk about, et cetera, you may listen to a little bit of it. But in a way, it's almost too much, and so you would turn it off. So the key first is that you open yourself to it. The second reason that story is so powerful, and a great, I'll call it a great vehicle, not a tool, a vehicle,
right,
is that when you hear a story, I mean, I'm listening to your story of this woman who had written 300 papers. I'm thinking to myself, I worked on 600 projects. Have I lost all those 600? So suddenly I was inside her story. Her story was inside me. I was relating to it.
Like it was happening to you at some level.
Exactly. And so there is a second reason why story works so powerfully, is that you actually begin to be a part of it. So I don't know. I think I'm going to stop there because those are two really important reasons why story works. My guests today have even more to say about storytelling, as you will see. And yes, we have two guests today. Each has made enormous impacts on many, many lives. And if you never heard of them, it's because they are like yeast. They each work quietly yet powerfully, creating something that simply, it tastes so much better because they did what they did. So I'm going to bring them on and introduce them to you. All right. My first one that I'll introduce is Loren Niemi. Loren has spent 47 years as a professional storyteller, creating, collecting, performing, teaching, and writing about what it means to be human with audiences of all ages in urban and rural settings. In 2016, he was the recipient of the National Storytelling Network's Lifetime Achievement Award. In 2021, he founded the American School of Storytelling, offering online and in-person classes and workshops on traditional, personal, and business stories. He is the author of 5 books, including What Haunts Us, those non-traditional ghost stories, and his newest work, Circus Rex, a novel of misadventure and offhanded humor, and co-authored 2 others, including Inviting the Wolf In, Thinking About Difficult Stories. Loren, welcome to Unlocked.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So good to have you. Okay, my second guest And it's only because T of TJ comes after L of Loren. my, my second guest is TJ Elliott, formerly ETS's Chief Learning Officer and Vice President of its HR division for 15 years. TJ now leads the theater company he co founded in 2018, Knowledge Workings. His current work represents a return to a career that he held in the late 1970s. Today, he is co writer of the 2019 play Alms with Joe Keenan, Lazy Eye at Warren Robertson Studio Theater, and most recently, writing, directing, and producing two unexpected, break even off Broadway runs of the captive audiences reviews. The list goes on, but still, I must include that he wrote the lead chapter in the book, Smarter Innovation, using interactive processes to drive better business results. Well, I love that incredible title. Edited by Katrina Pugh, by the way, with a chapter in it called Sitting in the White Spaces by yours truly. TJ, welcome back to Unlocked.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Ah,
Thank you for that kind introduction.
oh, you are so welcome, both of you. Well, listen, welcome back, both of you. You're listening to Unlocked, and I'm your host. My first topic to ask you to explore is what stories are worth telling. But first, I want to hear from the wonderful, delicious sponsor, the Smith Island Baking Company. Since the 1800s, Smith Island cakes have been a symbol of family, faith, and community. In 2009, the Smith Island Baking Company was created as the custodian of this treasure, shipping hundreds of thousands of cakes made from scratch, packed with care, and delivered to celebrations of all sizes and shapes, far and wide. Today, people just like you celebrate important occasions with a cake. When is your next birthday? Welcome back. You're listening to Unlocked, and I'm your host, Madelyn Blair. I've just introduced my two truly remarkable and accomplished guests, Loren Niemi and TJ Elliott. I had just asked them to talk about what stories are worth telling. Loren, let's begin with you.
Well, what story is worth telling are the stories that we. How do I want to put this? Let me tell a story. So last Thursday, I was working with 44 nurses, ministers, social workers, and other people in the health professions up in Bemidji, Minnesota. And one of the things that we wanted to do was answer the question, what story have you not told? What story have you not been asked to tell? And, in the morning, I worked with them on telling personal stories, which was quite interesting. Some of them had never really, had occasion to talk about their own lives outside of a work context. And then in the afternoon, and this is the part I liked, is we moved to the workplace and asked them, what is the best workplace experience you've had? What is the worst workplace experience you've had? What did you learn from these things? And after the worst workplace experience, I could tell they were engaged because I actually got them as a group to howl like wolves, release tension. So that's a start of an answer. Those stories that need to be told, that want to be told, that we're often reluctant to tell. Sometimes they're thought of as difficult stories, and sometimes they're just thought of being ephemeral stories. But even the ephemeral stories serve a purpose. Mm-hmm. So, TJ, your turn.
Okay, that I love that. That reminds me of in my corporate days asking people using Cooper Ryder and Gervais Bush's stuff on appreciative inquiry to say, well, what's the best What's the best experience that you know that you've had in a particular thing, and so that can be very powerful. And I think also showing what's the worst experience can be very powerful as well. I think the stories that are worth telling are the stories that are revelatory, right? So they're not mundane. They're showing something, and I think this connects to what Loren said there. Sometimes we're a little bit reluctant because of what they're going to reveal about ourselves, but every story that is told has an audience, even if the audience is just ourselves. And what does that audience need? What are they looking for? How are they going to be engaged? There's a writing teacher who I really don't know at all. I just found her stuff on the web. Her name is Katie Winkler, and I just love this phrase she had. She said, "We need stories that lift us out of the silt of our own experience." And I thought, oh, that's good. Lift us out of the silt of our own experience. So those are the stories that need to be told there. We're in our own experience, and a story that sort of has us out, has us look at things in a different way, has us hold our own life out there so it can be examined more profitably.
It's amazing, both of you. Those kinds of stories are ones where we sort of. I have in my imagination somebody walking down a commercial street, and you look in the window, and what you see is not what's in the window, but the reflection of you. And as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking, you bring people to a place where they see a reflection of their past and what their lives are like. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, but on the other hand, at the same time, when you do look into the window, there's a world there. And, the question, sometimes you're invited into that world. One of my favorite things when I'm in other foreign cities I don't live in and don't is to walk down the street, particularly early in the morning, and watch shops open up and watch people begin to go and sit for coffee, or, the greengrocer putting out the fruit. There's something so human and lovely about that moment, and normally you would just ignore it. You would just ignore it.
Yeah.
Context helps define what the story is. You know, there is the story which is the self. There is the story which is the self in a landscape.
That actually reminds me of what I wanted to ask you next, which was that stories live across many, many layers of our lives. What does that mean to our day to day? And TJ, maybe we'll start with you.
Well, I mean, it's very interesting that you should ask that question at this time of me, because I had one of my dearest friends die a month ago, and so I was at his funeral, and his family was there, and so there's a story that I tell about him, about how he changed my life. He was 21, I was 20. We were both producing a traveling production of Waiting for Godot. Talk about hubris. They're 20 and 21 years old, and we were in it as well. And I screwed up magnificently in it. And then he sat me down after it was all over, and he had this light shining in my eyes, which I think was on purpose. And he said, "Hey, TJ, are you running your life, or is your life running you?" And this was a turning point in my life. But in terms of the layers, his siblings, of whom he had 12, had never heard the story. Right? So this is their except for one older brother, they're hearing that. Other people who were at the funeral, who knew him as a teacher, who knew him as an actor, who knew him as a member of a fellowship, they'd never heard the story. So I'm thinking, well, for me, it's a seminal moment in my life. For them, going back to your metaphor, your image of looking in the window there, to Lauren's point, they're looking into the window of McKeever and going, "Oh wow, he had that effect," and then returning with, "And he had that effect upon me." So it then, it burst out into a whole bunch of other stories, and we're all feeling better because of those stories.
Loren, you want to add anything to that?
Well, no, actually, I don't. I think that was a really lovely answer.
Great.
Um,
Then I want to move. I want to move on because it reminds me of this the fact that we are living in, I'll call it, interesting times. Uh, what ways does history influence and instruct us as to the stories we really need to be telling, and not just, well, like just right now?
okay, I will take a shot at answering that one because it you know history is what is chosen to be remembered or recorded, documented. So the old cliche is history is written by the victors, right? And the vanquished, they have their own version of history and they have their own stories which are told person to person, not necessarily written down. And you wonder, what is the seedbed of revolution? Well, it's one of the seedbeds of revolution is those stories which are the history that is not acknowledged, where people say, "I have suffered enough," and finally they. I just posted today a quote from uh, Martin Luther King talking about, he says, "I can't condone riots, but I understand where they come from."
Mhm.
So,
Mhm.
so one of the values of history is that it's often unappreciated, but it does provide an opportunity to inform us of um, both what the official story is and to raise questions about what is unspoken. So that in these troubled times, as there's a rush to have only one kind of history, um, it is more important than ever, and it is more critical than ever that even if that history is not identified in a formal sense, that other histories be held and shared in communities.
Yeah, I love that because especially towards the end there where you said there's this rush to have only one story. And my own take is that that probably has been true for a while. That one group is saying no, only our story, and your story needs to be erased, and now another group saying no, 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 we're going to erase your story, and only ours is going to go forth there. I mean, I'm fascinated by the stories of history and how they affect us or don't affect us. I mean, people want to make many parallels there, and they're probably not exact. I'm not sure that I go along with history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. I think it may have the same meter, but I don't find the same parallels that people are constantly bringing up these days, or brought up in other days. It's interesting though. I was reading somebody recently, and they made this connection between storytelling and belief. And I thought, oh boy, that's a great connection because I think the stories you tell are sort of rising up from the beliefs you hold, the
Oh
way
yeah,
you see the world, right?
oh
So the way you see the world, as you point out there, is very different for the downtrodden, the vanquished, the 90%, than it is for the people who perhaps have been in charge of official stories.
yeah, yeah. I think that is in fact the case. Um, you know, I would even go further. I would say that stories determine what our belief options are. That there is a story which is, if we want to talk about faith, if we, the faith is the agreement with or the hearing of, in the agreement with a particular story, and then it's like everywhere else. All the other stories are interesting, but they're not my story. They're not necessarily true, right? Right. And the truth rises not from the story, but from the faith that we put into the story. So,
Yeah, yeah, no, I think there's a I don't know his name, but you can find him on threads under Rev War, and there's this wonderful fellow who every day is putting out what happened that day as the Revolutionary War was starting. And he's been doing this for several years, but of course, the big moment just came, Concord and Lexington there. But what I love about what he's doing is he's telling other stories, right? So, and I consider myself a history buff, but he's illuminating letters that were being sent and stories that were being told what was going on in England, right? It's like completely different story about what was happening in the colonies than the ones that we learned in grammar school. And I makes you think like, okay, yeah, to your point there, those stories, they form the belief. It moves the other way around. It's not always belief forming stories. It can be both ways.
Right. Yeah. It's a dialectic. Oh, there's a word. It's a dialectic process. Uh,
Mhm. Mhm.
belief, faith, story, structure. You know, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And what happens is over a time, certain cultural aspects become embedded. I mean, if we think about even the 60s, I mean, we're all old enough to have lived in the 60s. You know, we have our own specific understanding of that history in terms of what we did, we saw happening, what was happening around us. But if you talk to a millennial or a Gen Xer, someone who's even 10 years younger than us, their version of the 60s is not quite the same. And when you get to 20 years or 30 years younger than us, I mean, I had students when I was teaching who said, when you talk about the 60s, they say, yeah, that's when it all went bad. And you say, well, what do you mean it all went bad? And they said, there was no internet yet.
Yeah,
I
I
mean,
know.
for them,
Yeah.
the world begins with digital.
Yeah.
And everything before that, you might as well be talking about the Renaissance before that. It's all.
It, it's so interesting that you say that because I had to. We were driving across from Jersey to come here, and I was talking to my wife Marjorie about this, and with she said, when I was growing up, I didn't really understand what the 30s were. This is the same point you're making, right? She's like,
That's right.
I,
Exactly.
I, I didn't get that, And so just as those students are like, don't really understand the 60s, I didn't really understand the 30s. Then you read and you stuff and you get a better understanding, but still, you didn't live in the 30s.
That's right.
You didn't know what it was like to see a bread line there. That didn't happen.
Yeah.
But I had stories from my parents about those
Oh
times.
yeah.
So your
Oh yeah.
point's well taken, which says to me that stories really have a remarkable power in historical perspective, simply because we're allowed to see things we never experienced ourselves.
Right. And those stories
Absolutely.
that your parents tell or your grandparents tell have the advantage of they are grounded in specific personal history.
Yes, it is.
As opposed, you can't simply dismiss them as being academic. You can't simply dismiss them as saying, oh, that's a political view or that's a particular academic view. It becomes a matter of this is what we lived.
Mhm.
You know, I know
I,
my father's, growing up in the Depression, he would deliver milk from the family farm on his way to high school. He would deliver the milk, but when it came time to collect the money at the end of the week, my grandmother went and did it because if you didn't have money, you had to have something, right? Something in exchange for that milk, whether it was
wow.
potatoes or whether it was a chicken or whether, and she did not take no for an answer, and right. And so I always thought of my grandmother as being a very sort of soft, wonderful, cuddly Finnish woman who with great baked goods. But to hear my father say, she was a no nonsense businesswoman, it's kind of like, oh, okay, and it tells me something about the time as well as about her.
Well, it also
But
tells
I
you
I
something
think
about yourself. I'm sorry, TJ.
no, that's what I was about to say is that there's this familial power to stories there. And as my life went on and I met more people and things like that, I come from an Irish Catholic background, so storytelling it's in the air. It's it's there from the very first thing. And I come from a big family myself, and so there's a whole thing of who gets to tell the story at the table before dinner is over. But my father had a story that made the five boys, I have one sister, really think, am I ever going to be able to live up to that? Because he was 17 years old or 16 years old, and he answered a job ad in the Daily News, New York Daily News, and there were 400 applicants, and he got the job. And you're like, man, that's that is a high bar to aspire to get over there, and more of that there. So I think stories become a framework and and inspiration. And I guess it works the other way. Luckily, I had good stories, but I'm sure there are folks there who are sort of like, am I repeating the story of my father or my grandfather or my grandmother or whatever it may be?
Yeah, TJ, that was something of what I was going to be saying, because when I listened to my grandparents who came over from another country to this country, they immigrated, and hearing their stories, yes, they were hard and all that, but what I got out of them was that, hey, I'm related to her. So some of her strength,
Yeah.
some of her courage, some of his values, they've got to be somewhere in me. And it was, for me, very elevating in terms of what I thought I might be able to do with my life. Now, real power. Well, well, let's shift a little, because I think this show is more about career and organizations. So let's shift a little bit. And what are some of the ways in which organizations actually subvert what might be the stories that are the most important for them to continue to flourish? Either one of
Loren,
you.
Loren, you go first.
Well, I think the most ordinary and common ways organizations subvert the stories that they should tell or ought to tell are when they no longer really give story a place in the organization itself. They, when in an organizational context, brand is a story, but brand is a story of the relationship you have to the customer or the client or the market. But it is not the only story in the organization. There's also the story of the founding of the organization, of the crafting of the mission, of who and how we work as a community. And oftentimes what happens is organizations get stuck on a particular thing. They get stuck on brand or market. Sometimes they get stuck on mission without thinking about how do they relate it to the work they're actually doing. It becomes the sort of the heroic holding up of the past rather than a recognition of the ongoing nature of the work. So,
Yeah, I that last point is particularly important to me. Um, I was very influenced by the work of VJ Govindarajan on innovation, and VJ would talk about this three-box solution in which you had to you had to make sure that you were managing the present, you had to figure out how you were going to forget the past, certain elements of the past there, and then you had to figure out how you were going to invent the future. And when he said forget the past, he wasn't saying you were forgetting all of the past. He simply was saying you needed to shift from those things which were holding you in. And of course, I saw this in a number of organizations that I would sort of refer to as operate and maintain organizations. They had reached a certain point. They had a very powerful brand. They had tremendous market share in an area there. So they were all about continuing that story. But the world around them was going to change.
oh
It's
yeah,
like the old buggy whip story there is that there were some really fantastic buggy whip factories in 1899, and they weren't there 20 years later there. So that you have to figure out how you change the story. And the other thing about organizations is that I did a lot of leadership development work. That was one of my primary roles at ETS, but I had done it before that at other companies. That the companies became Verizon Wireless and banks and things like that. And what I would say is I would ask people, what is the story people tell about you?
oh yeah.
Okay, and so then a comparison between or a contrast between what you think the story is people tell about you and what other people in that group are going to say. No, I think you got that wrong. Some more positive, some a little bit more critical there. And then how does your story fit into this organizational story then? If the story that people tell about you is that you're a maverick and you're in an operate and maintain organization, how are you going to deal with that?
Hmm.
What you do with that is you say there can only be so many Mavericks in an organization. And most organizations can only handle a few.
Well, put those Mavericks in the research and development area.
Yes,
Yeah,
that's one
yeah,
possibility.
and then give the research and development area enough money to do that there.
Actually do something. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or you can put them
There,
into,
this whole thing of organizational stories. Art Kleiner did a whole thing about it in the Fifth Discipline Field Book years and years ago. Other people have talked about it as a powerful tool within organizations. But I think you alluded to this as well, is that some organizations want to subvert or or tamp down particular stories. Amy Edmondson has she's now built a whole oeuvre of books and articles about how organizations tell stories about failures, how they mainly don't tell stories about failures, and
Hmm.
instead of learning from it, they bury it.
uh, who was the major Oh, Jack Walsh.
Jack Walsh. Yeah.
Everybody talked about Jack Walsh as if he was perfection. And then there was this little story about when he was a young man where he actually blew up a whole building experimenting with something. And you know who told that story late in his life? Was his administrative assistant, because she knew that story. Now, what happened was that the board said, you know what? He's a young man. He's pushing the edges. He's good. So the story disappeared and he became this perfection. I just loved the story because to me, it made him much more human and much more approachable than
Oh,
this
yeah.
other being.
Very very early in my years of working with organizations, I had occasion to work with what was at that point um, the AT&T system before, as they were breaking up into their separate components.
Mm-hmm.
And I was asked to come to meet with a group that was doing a retreat, and it became very clear very soon that part of what they were doing was not preparing for the future, but they were trying to figure out how to manage their grief at no longer being able to work together.
Yeah.
And the stories they told were stories about how, by and large, how they had been linemen and pioneers, and how in the middle of storms they would call on each other to go out and save the day. And their fear is that spirit of can do, will do, would not transfer once they became Bell and Northwest and Pacific and the various broken up components, that the
Yeah.
culture would shift so that they would forget their roots.
And it did. They were right.
They were right. Did happen.
You,
Yeah.
you know, that story makes me think of why one needs a a federal government, because there are some times when you need for people to be stepping across what would a boundary, that you might call it a state, you might call it an agency. There are times when you have to step over in order to solve a problem. Take the wildfires in the West. I mean, it's only because there are firefighters who are willing to go to California or wherever that fire is that makes it possible for us to get it controlled. So there really are moments when, as a larger community, we need to have that ability to step over. So I love that AT&T story. I really do.
And since you mentioned wildfires, one of the most famous examples of storytelling is Norman Maclean's Young Men and Fire, and then Carl Weick, the organizational theorist, took it to sort of be the spine for a whole book on sense making. So to your point there, that story was about one particular fire, and it then, because there is a sort of connection, a federation there, then other firefighters learn about it there, and it became something there. And then organizations, the U.S. Navy is like, well, we're not fighting fires, but we do have aircraft carriers that have crises there. What does this story mean to us? How do we interpret this story? And banks and refineries and all of them there. So it's interesting how a story in one circumstance can be so pertinent to other circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, it's the story. There's the story which is testimony. There's the story which is documentation. There's the story which is metaphor. And in each iteration, it starts from the same seed, but the way it gets applied and the way it gets understood shifts. So
Say more about that, Loren, because metaphors we use it almost unconsciously.
we do, but I mean, the basic, as I always approach it when teaching, metaphor at its fundamental is a way of making something complex more understandable by relating it to something you may know. So the great value of metaphor is it allows us to deal with difficult issues and difficult, complex things, once at a one step removed, in a way that people can emotionally go, "Oh, I get that," or "I'm willing to, allow for that or explore that." So.
Now, how does that relate to analogies?
Well, an analogy is a comparison. If this, then this, or if this in contrast to this. An analogy offers you two things. Metaphor is much more personal. It's much more. It's much more internalized, right? The difference. An analogy is she. This is an analogy using metaphors, right? Madelyn, you are a Cadillac, and TJ, you are a Prius, right?
It's true.
That's an analogy to a comparison of style, or a function or of structure, right? And the metaphor individually is, to this car represents a person, or represents a particular choice of, that you've made.
Loren, I've never been called a Cadillac before. I think that's really cool.
If we wanted to refine the metaphor, the question would be, what year Cadillac?
Please.
Do you have fins?
That's right. That classic 59 is the benchmark of Cadillac history. So.
Oh, I don't think I remember that one. No.
You can Google it. You'll see them. There's plenty of them around.
I think I have, yes.
Yes.
Well, but I think it's important to know to really understand that, because as I'm thinking about our audience, you're in your career and we've convinced them, I think, that story has a role to play, and maybe a very powerful one. And knowing those subtle differences between a metaphor and analogy, I think, is important. But let's take that another step. What kind of advice do you give to a leader or someone who aspires to be a leader, whether they're a CEO, a PTA president, a mayor, a mother? What kind of advice do you give them about using storytelling?
Well, my first advice would be to listen to other people telling stories, and I think,
would agree entirely, as that's the first piece.
Yeah, because sometimes the path to leadership, and this is very unfortunate, and as an old white guy, I probably benefited from it. Was the person who was quickest to tell a story, to establish a metaphor, to make a point there. And then they get to an elevated position there, and they're really lacking an understanding of what other people are going through. I'll never forget one of my lieutenants once said to me, TJ, for some people, this is just a job. And I thought, oh yeah, I guess so. So the first advice I would give is, go tease out those other stories. Go go listen from them, go, there's sort of four cylinders of communication, and a lot of leaders pay attention to expressing and giving feedback. They don't pay as much attention to accommodating, eliciting feedback from others, or facilitating the expression of others. So that's my advice.
Okay.
Yeah. TJ, you reminded me, I did a project one time with the Minneapolis Community Development Agency, and they were having some communication issues, and they couldn't figure out quite what the issue was. So the people who I was working with, we did a series of story circles, and it had across the agency, we had the maintenance people, the secretaries, the workers in the neighborhoods, the management folks, all mixed up in these circles, story circles. And the first question we asked them to talk about was, what do you bring to the organization? And people who had been there for, I mean, it was predicated on the fact that there was a whole group of people who had been there 2 years or less, who felt as they were not seen. And then there were people who had been there 20 years or more who couldn't understand why people didn't know where the bodies were buried, but hadn't bothered to tell anyone. Right? And so it's like in those circles, people actually got to sort of hear each other in terms of what they offered, and the people who needed to share where the bodies were buried got the message, which was critical, because it's like, if you're going to see council member X, or if you're going to work with the developer Y, this is what you need to know. And those senior management people weren't always the ones who were working or dealing with them, and so the people below them needed to know what was sort of verboten. So
I absolutely agree with that. When I came to ETS, it was already a 50-year-old organization. I mean, it had tremendous history. It was really well known there. And but I had been an organizational consultant, so I knew a little bit about some of the traps that were there for a newcomer. So I listened, I got stories. All I did early on was to get story after story after story. I read things that had been saved in the library. The library was a tremendous resource there. And then I started to tell new people there what the most important commandment was at ETS, was that ETS repelled invaders, but it welcomed pilgrims. So
wow,
if
there's
you're
a
a
nice
pilgrim, you're going to hear stories. You're going to learn about the traditions and the history of the place there. If you're an invader, you think you need to come in and change everything to knock down the walls and stuff there, and you will be repelled.
Oh, you have finally named what used to happen at the World Bank when I was there. New people were definitely repelled if you came in to change it. But if you came, and it wasn't this was an organization, at least when I was there, it was the cream of the cream. They had 250,000 applicants for every job, just about. So if you were there, you had something to offer. But if you came in learning, as you say, as a pilgrim, it was fine. You could go in and be quite effective. Great. I think that's an analogy, isn't it?
It could work.
Well, I have to ask one more curious question. TJ, I know you because you write, well, we've worked together at Columbia, but also because you write plays. And to me, a play is a story. Mm-hmm. And I just wanted to hear you talk about that linkage there. Loren, to me, you are a storyteller. I know that. I've known that for many years. But TJ, why don't you make that link for people?
Well, plays have such an ancient tradition, and as stories do, right? So, Homer is telling his story, arguably one of the greatest storytellers ever. Whoever's writing the Bible is telling those stories, and at the same time, there are plays being performed as part of rituals and ceremonies. There, I think the difference with a play is that it is collaborative, right? So a playwright can write the text of the story and can think about the rising conflict in order to keep the engagement of the audience there, and can use all of the tricks and mechanisms there. But then the playwright hands it to a director, and to actors, and actors bring it alive there. It's interesting. Recently, there was a young, fairly famous actor who said, "Well, I don't like being called a storyteller," and I said, "Well, what are you then? If you if you're not someone who is there to make this story come alive for people in a particular way." And I think it's why theater continues, despite many challenges, to be powerful. I went to some theater with my wife and my youngest, my son, a couple weeks ago, and I went to 4 shows in like 8 days, and different audiences. One was like an off Broadway audience, and another one was Broadway musical, and it, in each case, the audience is there because they want to hear something different than what they are hearing in their own life, or they want to hear something that confirms what they've decided about their own life. And what the playwright needs to figure out is, how do you do that in the most effective way? You've only got a certain amount of time there. You've brought people in, they've paid for a ticket, whatever. It's different than storytelling in that there are expectations in the seeing of a play that aren't always there in the telling of a story. But
Lauren,
underneath it, there is that spine. It is storytelling.
yeah. Lauren?
Well, I often think about the idea that the essence of theater is that you are telling a story that you want to tell as consistently as possible, the same way every time.
Yeah.
And in a real storytelling situation, you are in a relationship with the audience in the moment, and you are, I will. There are stories I've told hundreds of times, but I think I probably only told them exactly the same way twice. Because I match the story, what is told, the amount of detail, the rhythm, the language structures, and the way it's told to the needs of the audience in the room. So it is much more fluid, but it is the same intention. And I agree with TJ. Audiences come, they want to either have the experience of something they do not know and could not have not had, or they want to have some confirmation of an experience or an emotion that is already there. And part of the task of being of a good story. Well, let me go back. I'm getting sidetracked here right now because Homer did not work with a written script. Homer, it was like a soap opera. It was episode by episode, night after night, and every night, he made sure that both the Iliad and the Odyssey had cliffhanger moments where everyone could stop, drink some wine, and say, "Well, tomorrow we'll go for the next piece."
Yeah. Yeah. He knew what he was doing.
Yeah.
Lauren, I really appreciate what you said, though, about the fact that the audience has different expectations and that you've never told the story necessarily the same way. I've often heard great storytellers say that the audience listens the story out of the teller.
Oh yeah, I've heard that. I've experienced that.
Yeah.
I had an experience one time. I was in Hibbing, Minnesota, and there was a story that was nagging, and it was so clear to me that it wanted to be told. It was not a story I intended to tell. It was not a story I was entirely comfortable telling, but I told it just so I could clear it out of the way. And about 10 years later, I had this woman come up to me and say, "I saw you tell one time in Hibbing." And I said, "Oh, really? How did you enjoy it?" And she said, "It was fabulous. You told one story." And she immediately zeroed in on that story. And at that moment, I thought that was the story. That story was for her.
It was for her.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And when I asked her about it,
Yeah.
she began to tell it back to me, not the way I told it, but I could see where it had connected with her life and how it had informed her emotional set. And I was so thankful for her for even bothering to come up and say, "I saw you and heard you 10 years ago tell this story."
Fantastic.
It was such a wonderful confirmation.
Wow.
Just quickly, a very rewarding moment in that vein is we had our play Honor that played off Broadway, and before that was in festivals and stuff. And my son Gifford, who was he invited a lot of his younger friends, so he's like 30, and so they would come and they would go, "Oh my gosh," it was a play about office politics. And they would say, "Oh, I know the people in those play," and I would say, "Oh, you know people like that?" They say, "No, I know those people," and I thought, you can't know those people, but they do, and so I think that's a story, as you say, Loren. That story, that play was for that person, that
Mhm.
that it hit them in that way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I hope that our audience has discovered how powerful stories can be through this. But I think they're missing out on knowing what the two of you do more specifically. So I'm going to move to our usual grounds for thought and let you take the stage and describe your current work. Every now and then, there is something that changes how I think about the world. Grounds for Thought is a place where I talk about these moments so that you can explore the meaning for yourself.
What is most important for me at the moment is I've suddenly become married to the American School of Storytelling. I created it as a pandemic project, to keep me from going nuts, to continue teaching online. And then my partner, Christine, found a space, literally found 1,200, 1,500 square feet of space that we could afford. And we moved into it. And now we're doing online, in person, and performances. Right. And so I'm bringing in storytellers. Interestingly enough, I'm having open mics for storytelling and for poetry. And we're developing a community for in that process of people who would not necessarily see themselves as poets or storytellers, but they're coming, they're listening, and they're telling. So it's very exciting for me to do that. Oh, well, there's the book. That's the other thing is I have a novel out, Circus Rex, which started off as a memoir, but the facts made such little sense it needed fiction to actually have a narrative arc. So, and it's available for me or Amazon or whoever you get books from. TJ?
Well, there's a famous Joan Didion line from the White Album. We tell ourselves stories in order to live, and so uh, part of what I've been doing living since I left DTS in 2020 is producing plays. And after I got through the eighth one, before the ninth one started, I thought, I've got to write some of this stuff down. I've got to tell some of these stories about what it's like. And taking a page from one of my favorite poets, Wallace Stevens, I called it 13 Ways of Looking at Self-Producing. And my son, Gifford Elliott, who's a Cal Arts graduate and knows a lot more formally about theater than I ever will, he agreed to co-author it with me. And so it's what we learned in the form of these stories about different aspects of what would be useful for people to know. So now it's out on Amazon, Kindle, and in June it'll be out on other platforms, and it's very reasonably priced because it's more important for us than anything that other people get up and tell their own story. It's one of the reasons I was very excited to come on here today, Madelyn, with Loren, because I think what Loren is doing is tremendously important. I don't think people feel confident enough to tell their own stories, whether it's in theater, okay, here's how you can self-produce, or it's just being able to get up and do it in another gathering there. So there's my book, there's the American Storytelling there, and of course we've got another play coming up in August, part of the Broadway Bound Theater Festival at the AMT Theater in New York. But and again, we'll be telling another story.
Well, Loren Niemi and TJ Elliott, I can't tell you how much I have enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. I
It's been
enjoyed it
very
a lot.
yeah.
Ah, gosh, what a conversation. Well, I want to thank you for joining me today, and I hope you learned something new because I know I did. And if you want to comment on anything or ask me a question or give me an idea for a topic, just email me, madelyn@madelynblair.com, and I will read your emails and respond. And if you're on YouTube, please click the like button and subscribe. Yes, it helps me, but it also helps other people who are looking for this kind of information. I'm Madelyn Blair, wishing you infinite possibilities. as you unlock the resilient leader in you.